Good morning and welcome to the University of Salford. My name is Professor Andy Mia, and today we have hopefully one of many sessions about science communication and working to get your research out into the wider world. I'm Chair in Science Communication at the University of Salford, and my work is all about bringing our research into the wider world through presentations, installations, podcasts, YouTube videos, you name it. We're trying to use as much as we can to get the word out there. And we're having our first session to talk about how you can give better presentations, how you can use creative tools to hopefully level up your presentation skills. But as I mentioned, it's part of a wider program of training for our doctoral researchers. I'm delighted to welcome in Dr. Kripetix to talk about this program that's happening over the next year, hopefully. Good morning.
Good morning, Andy. Hi. Thank you for introductions. So I'm very pleased to kick off this new training and development program with this very interactive session. So indeed,
as with many of these things, it's an experiment. So this is the first time we're doing this as a hybrid live production where we'll hopefully have some demonstrations of things that work rather than things that fail. But tell us a bit more about the training program. We've got some people joining us from YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and in the room, of course, on our Peel campus too.
So the new training for our School of Science and Engineering and Environment PGR students is designed to teach them some very important skills that they can have, not just to be able to deliver their work on time and with lots of success, but also to bring some rigor in their research practices going forward and learn how to present themselves, how to communicate about themselves, about their science. And also we will host a number of talks from our academics this term. So we kick off with the seminar series tomorrow for the next 5 weeks, and we are hoping to bring a variety of science and research in general to all our PGR students. Next term we will reverse roles, so the students will be the ones who will be on the spotlight, and we will train them in a safe place for giving them feedback on their communication. So hopefully by doing this, they will become much better and have much more wisdom and skills to present going forward.
That sounds fantastic. And I'm still thinking back as you were talking there to my first conference presentation, which of course at that time, this is many years ago now, it was the only way in which you could really get your ideas and your research out there. And that was the key thing, is to make sure you can present to your peers about your research, and hopefully off the back of that, develop publications, develop a relationship with associations, with journals. And I remember the first presentation, it was using PowerPoint, and I had my kind of lecture cards with me. And my goodness, it feels like a long time ago. There's so much more you can do now, isn't there?
That's absolutely right, Andy. I remember my first conference when my PhD supervisor sent me to Belgium to deliver a poster, and I never knew how to make a poster myself. So I had to figure it all out as I went. But it was a wonderful learning experience. We're on the spot. So luckily we now provide some training for our students and also give them a boost of confidence so they can go prepared.
Yeah, and that's really what it's all about. And I think certainly for today, it's trying to find your way through communicating your research on whatever platforms you feel comfortable. And that's a big sort of thrust of what I'll be talking about today. So thank you for joining us for this introduction. We're going to, in the room now, switch over to the YouTube channel, and I'll perhaps see you towards the end, hopefully.
Thank you. See you later.
Thanks so much. So we have a lot to cover today, and we're using this platform called StreamYard, which is a professional streaming platform that goes out to various social media channels, whether it's YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook, and it allows us to reach out further. And I've been working really, for many years trying to see how we can push our work out into the wider world. I remember as a PhD student, one of my professors told me that an average academic article is read by 6 people. And that's a real motivator to sort of think about how we reach further. And of course, no one wants to write an academic article that's average. But the reality is that so much of what we do stays within our peer group or just within the academic sort of walls. And hopefully, by using digital platforms, by thinking about presentations, by getting comfortable with sharing your work more widely to lots of different audiences, you can think about hopefully new ways in which you can reach out to people, connect with them, involve them in your research. And over this journey that we have for the hour and a half today, and we're going to finalize things with a Instagram live as a demonstration. We'll do a few demonstrations along the way, but there are kind of three things I want to get across really today. The first is tips for presenting in whatever format it might be. And as mentioned already, the kind of when I started off, the opportunities were conference presentations in person with PowerPoint. That was more or less it. And that was how you shared your research. Now there are so many opportunities, and we have to think about things like presenting in person and online, or in hybrid settings like this one. And trying to do that well and deal with the challenges that presents is one of the things that I've wrestled with over the years. And it's still always a dynamic process. So I'll talk about that. I'll talk about how you can use digital platforms to curate your collaborator network. And for me, there's a really important connection between using platforms like LinkedIn or Twitter to build your professional network, but also to share your research. And a big part of that is building your own digital footprint as a researcher. One of the key things I've discovered over the years is so much of my collaborations have come to me through the people that are in these platforms. And one of the things I say to people is ignoring social media today is like ignoring email in 1997. It's the way in which people connect with each other. And in a world that's incredibly vast, the academic world is big, you kind of have to find ways to manage it. So in the past, you might have had a Rolodex with things like names and contacts and things. That LinkedIn is a fantastic way to build that community. So social media as a platform for professional networking is the second thing I want to talk about today. And the final thing is to talk about some of the tools you can use to create content, to share work more widely, to build that community around content creation. Because for me, presenting yourself as a scholar, as an academic, as a scientist, whatever category you see yourself in, it's really about you having a chance to relate to people creatively, thoughtfully. And what I've always thought about is how you can use creative tools, whether it's PowerPoint, Google Slides, Prezi, and I'll talk about some of these applications, or video and social media. All of these tools provide ways for you to also reflect on how you present yourself, what kind of presenter you want to be. So thinking about these tools as platforms for professional networking and creation, discovery, exploration, for me is really the essence of what I'm talking about. And it's often the case that opportunities come to me through these environments too. So the collaborator network that I have is through digital platforms. And of course, over the last couple of years, we've seen lots of academic events, associations pivot into online events almost exclusively, and some of them aren't really going back. So thinking about how you convey yourself, but also the different roles that you may have within this academic world, which is becoming far more open than it was certainly when I started off. Open partly because I think people expect us to be present as well. There's a huge amount of respect and trust in the academic community from the general public, from society at large. And I think that special place that we occupy is one of the main reasons I sort of feel compelled to be present publicly and to get as much as we can out into the public domain about what we're doing. It's also for me a crucial pillar of a democratic society, and for me that's another reason to be part of this open world in which sort of social media thrives, is that it's in the past we might have simply interviewed for television or radio, or interviewed for journalists for the printed press. Now we have the opportunity to actually share what we're doing directly with the public through our own channels of communication. And that's really been a motivator for many people in this world of academia for the last 15 or so years. Since the kind of internet revolution, we've had this opportunity to make our own content, to not be sort of restricted by the media. In fact, many of us sort of working in this field see that as a huge opportunity to completely redistribute knowledge in society. So there's also a kind of ideological motivation for me to be present. But a key thing I want to get across as well today is that it's not just about you. It's not all about you being on a camera, sharing content and being present in that way. There's lots of different roles that we'll talk about today. And hopefully at the end of this, you'll have a sense in which your contribution and whatever you're comfortable with, you'll have a starting point that you can take further into the future. But just to get a bit of a sense where people are from. So I know obviously got people in the room at Salford on our new science building in the Peel campus. But if there are people in the chat that are dialing in from elsewhere, let me know where you're from. Let me know your name. Feel welcome to share content in the comments on whichever platform you're in, and we'll bring those comments into the chat as well. So let us know where you are, but also let us know what you'd like to discover today, what sorts of things you'd like to talk about, because for me it's also about making sure that this session is something that works for you. So if there are specific things that are of interest, then we can cover those too. Otherwise, I'll just step through the presentation and demonstrations as we sort of go through. And as essentially, I want to start off by talking a bit about presenting, giving presentations, and perhaps to step back from that a little bit and ask the question, what is it a presentation consists of? And historically, and still, I suppose to some extent, we're giving presentations about our research at conferences, at academic events. But often before that, there's lots of other presentations that we have to give, whether it's to our peers in research seminars, whether it's to examiners for progression within PhD research. These are all moments where you have to have that thoughtfulness about how you present yourself. So I want to offer a few sort of bits of guidance and really, I suppose, personal experiences about how I approach things. The first thing to say is that these things, I think, get a lot easier when you do more of them. And so there's no sort of substitution for just doing a lot of presentations to get to the point where you feel comfortable. So today I'll be using different presentation tools to share materials with you, and hopefully they'll all work. But I'm reasonably comfortable if they don't work. So I think that's one thing that's really helpful to do before you walk into a room or before you jump on a call. Be confident with the possibility that things may fail. And of course, when you're delivering online, if the connection fails, there's very little you can do, and that may happen. You might have a backup connection that you can use and switch to, but thinking about what those consequences might be in whatever setting is a key part of I think, readying yourself for that presentation. There's also a lot you can do in advance of the presentation itself, I think. So as I mentioned at the start, when I gave my first conference presentation, I had cards which had sort of notes on them that I would then sort of speak to as I was giving my presentation. And in the first delivery of my first presentation, I realized that just didn't work very well. So you have to kind of think about how you script things out. And I want to talk about that a little bit too. But even before you get up on the stage, I think there's things that you can do to feel comfortable, to make yourself put yourself in a position where you actually feel ready for this. One of the things that I do is tell myself I'm going to enjoy the presentation. And I think you can sort of convince yourself that this is going to be good. Even if you're a bit anxious about it, it can be a way to just sort of get into the groove with it. Many people do. It's a bit like a kind of theatre performer. You kind of get yourself into the zone. There's lots of rituals people go through to ready themselves for a performance, and you may find your own, but certainly you can do those sorts of things and make them part of your process to actually get to a point where you feel less anxious about it. I'm also a big fan of visualizations too, and a great way to help you with visualizations particularly is to get to know your venue before you have to get up there. So I always arrive early for presentations. I always make sure I can figure out the technology before I have to give the presentation. So I had an event just last week, which was part of the large event in London called New Scientist Live, and this was a talk to around 800 school children. So so I decided I would arrive there into London about 2.5 hours early and get to the venue at least an hour and a half before the event started, to then talk to the technicians, test out the technology, make sure everything was working, step through a kind of not so much a rehearsal, but just rehearsal for the technology. And there were problems for sure. There were like technology problems left, right, and center. So making sure I had enough time to do that was such a key part of it, and made me to feel more relaxed. There's also an element whereby you I think by getting to know the venue, by feeling like it's your space, arriving before the audience is a key way to actually deal with that anxiety as well. You make it your own rather than you being a visitor into the space once everyone's arrived into it. So thinking about the environment is crucial, and there's lots of small things that I think are really useful to bear in mind here. So for example, where are you going to stand for your talk? Where is that in relation to the computer? Is there a remote mouse that you can use to progress your presentations? I also, one of the things I do is take with me my own remote mouse, one that I know works, because often you might find, or it can happen, that one of the remote mice that the company has or the organizers have, or many don't have them. If you go to an academic conference, most people don't have these things. So making sure that you have enough technology to make it work for you is a really key way to be prepared for it. Of course, rehearsing your presentation is really valuable. One of the events that we have at the University of Salford every year is the TEDx University of Salford event. And one of the things we do with the presentations, and this is not something that everyone really loves doing, but until they actually do it, is to run through a presentation, a live dress rehearsal of the talk. Now, it's not always easy to do that in an event, but certainly practicing is a great way to sort of bottom out the duration of your talk, but also to give you some freedom to hopefully not be too tied to a script, because that's one of the challenges. How do you actually avoid, and actually there's interesting, because there are different conventions in different academic disciplines. So I've been to conferences where the convention is to read a manuscript. Now, in other disciplines, that's absolutely abhorrent to think about. I mean, it's for me, and I think it's right. I mean, I can see that to some extent, the reason to read a manuscript is you have such precision over your language, and there's such complexity to what you're talking about, that it's a helpful way to focus people's attention on what you're saying and avoid the kind of ways in which you might mumble or add things or deviate from your text in a way that isn't perhaps terribly helpful. But this you'll have to find out from your supervisors or from your community, what is the convention. It's important to get that convention right, but I think it's also helpful to think about your process as developmental. So rather than sort of focus on just what works for you right now, and it might be that reading part of the manuscript is a useful way to do it, try to think about some of the techniques to make it easier for the long term. And that's, again, a crucial thing to consider. It's not just that first presentation that you're sort of starting to work towards, it's also your career of giving presentations. I've seen funny videos on social media, Twitter and the like, where you see sort of academics posting about the amount of time they have to give presentations. And when you're a PhD student starting off, you might take 2 or 3 weeks to prepare your presentation. And the end point of that is when you're a professor, you're preparing your slides as you're walking up to the presentation stand. And it's not quite like that, but it's not far from it in terms of your ability to actually deliver something without too much preparation, because you know the material. And that's the other thing that's really important: knowing your material, understanding what you're going to say, having a sense of what you're going to say. But I think also, for me personally, and this is not for everyone certainly, but I think it's helpful to remember that when you're performing, when you're talking to an audience, you're there to give them something more than, I think, just the manuscript. And for me particularly, beyond just getting across your research and what you want to say, you're there to actually engage them as a person and hopefully build a relationship through that interface between you as a presenter and them as the audience. Now, that's really difficult, especially when you're doing it in an online setting, because you don't quite know who's out there. I can see people that are online, but the interaction is quite challenging. So you have to try to find ways to think about hopefully involving people, even if they're not doing it live, they do it subsequently. So here's a little Padlet that you can open up on your computer or your mobile device and start to introduce yourself to other people that are on the call too. And I think even having a sense of the sorts of questions you want to ask people during a presentation is a useful way to get them chatting, and to get them engaging with what you're saying. One of the things that's, I think, helpful about looking at social media content, content like TikTok, Instagram, is that a lot of the content creators are really good at thinking about how to engage audiences and using language that does that really well. So one of the things you might do, and this will depend very much on the context that you're presenting in. So if you're presenting to school kids for an event, the way in which you interact with them might vary considerably to if you're speaking to your peer group. So that's why when presenting and giving kind of guidance for presenting, it's not a single thing. There's no simple way to say this is how to present. A big part of, I think, the best things you can do are to think about what kind of presenter you want to be. And that might be that you look at other people in your field, other role models that you have in your life, whether it's directly related to your research or whether it's the broader world of kind of communication that's out there, which I think is fantastic inspiration, and say, well, I would like to be as good as that. Having those reference points, I think, is a really useful way to frame your approach over the years, but also to have something to work towards, and a way to actually hold yourself to account and analyze and critique your style. And that's where, again, there's a real synergy between what we can do now with social media, as I'll go on to talk about, and what you can do as a presenter. So if you're about to give your first academic presentation and you're worried about giving a presentation to an audience, one of the things you can do that's really helpful is to film your rehearsal. Film yourself just on your own in a room rehearsing your presentation, and see how it looks, see what kind of mannerisms there are. And there's two things you can do. One is to record yourself, play it back without sound. So you're just watching yourself and you're seeing how you speak, seeing how you convey yourself. You can look at things like hand gestures. You might be doing too much hand gestures or not enough. You're too static. You might see that you've not really got much movement in your body that then makes it seem quite flat as a presentation. And then you might adjust those mannerisms. Another thing you can do after you've done that is to turn the sound up, but not look at the screen, not look at the recording. Just listen to yourself. Think about the cadence of your voice. Think about the pauses within your presentation. Think about how you are conveying yourself with your speech, and consider what you might do. You might notice things like you're saying or things like These are all sort of quite common connectors in oral presentations, which are difficult to avoid in total, but you can do a great deal to hopefully minimize them and feel more comfortable. It's really hard, I think, especially when you are trying to present something that's difficult for the first time. But you can, I think, by listening to yourself, by recording yourself, you can get into a much better space than if you just get up there and do it. And apart from anything, every time you do that, it helps you rehearse what you're saying. And that's another key part of giving a presentation for me. Ever since that first presentation, and I remember I still got the presentation because we now have software that's been around for 20 or so years that allows us then to look back on these things. And I remember wanting to bring animation into PowerPoint, which was a really difficult thing to do at the time. And looking back, it's really awful to look at. But I remember after the presentation, people asking me how I did it and were really amazed by it. And what's interesting for me is to realize that by creating your presentation and by adding kind of creativity into it, by not just using a template from Microsoft that you just pull your stuff into, but actually thoughtfully designing your presentation, is also another way for you to rehearse your content. And that's a key thing that I hadn't realized until sort of I started doing this quite a bit. I realized that the way to avoid feeling anxious or feeling like you're going to run out of things to say is to spend time creating your presentation with creative tools. And that layering of time with your presentation is certainly one way that helps you practice it, remember it, and not have to worry too much about what you're doing. So, and that does get easier over time. The more you give your presentations, and obviously a lot of your research will be on similar themes. It may evolve, but the more you do it, the more comfortable you get with the material. The more you also can feel that you can deviate a little bit, go along tangents, and explore new interesting things. I give lots of presentations. I give certainly over the last sort of 15 or so years, I've given 400 to 500 presentations at conferences, events around the world. And one of the main motivations why I do it as well is that it helps you speak to different audiences. It helps you realize that your own subject isn't understood very well by people outside of it. And by talking to diverse audiences, you find a way to appreciate the challenge that people have to make use of what you're discovering and what you're researching. So it modifies your language. It helps you understand the broader context of the work that you're doing and where it may be applied. But it also gives you hopefully a sense of appreciation for the purpose of why we're here researching. And that is a key part of it too. when I started off, also another motivator was to harness some of these tools of communication, to actually make use of platforms to reach out. And at the time, many of the academic associations were just beginning to sort of think about the power of their digital networks. So communication for me was also a way to have a role within the academic associations that I wanted to be part of. So I started off building websites for academic associations, which were basically the only opportunities to create materials for them back then. And nobody could really do it very easily. So it was something that you could add to your assets to actually make yourself useful for an academic association. So you can see again how these sorts of tools may be a way for you to build collaborations, build a presence within your community, and goes beyond just standing up and giving a talk. I think when you get up on the stage, there's always a moment where you think, okay, this is, if you feel nervous, it's like, what do I do now? How do I sort of start off? And another thing that I do that I think is really helpful is to, before you get up there, work on the first line of your presentation. Make sure you know how you're going to start off. One of the useful tools that I use is to talk about something either personal as a way of starting off the presentation, or something that's happened on the day, often things that are in the news. You can always find something in the news that connects with what it is you're talking about, or it might be something that you've seen from an academic association. If your presentation is very technical and very niche and isn't easily connected to what's happening more widely in the world, then you can perhaps draw on something that you've read in a journal. And that can be a nice way for both of you to sort of feel that you've got a way into the presentation, but also a way for you to sort of hook the audience in. Because the challenge you have, and this is often the case, particularly if you stay within the academic sort of world immediately, and I would encourage you not to do that only, but actually find opportunities to reach out, and also reach out beyond your discipline. So there's so much emphasis now in research on multiple collaborations across different disciplines. There's so much emphasis to try to get researchers connecting more widely outside of their own subject. And I would say that the more you do that, the more you can remain really agile as a researcher, not stagnate as a researcher, but also discover how so much of what you're doing is connected to other areas of research as well, and sometimes dependent upon them. So giving yourself the chance to sort of speak about things that you've discovered that connect with your research is a nice way to feel comfortable giving that talk. There are other things you can do as well that I think are important. Think about your own presence, how you convey yourself. People have a particular preference for what they wear for presentations, and I think that's something important to think about, making sure that you have changes of clothes just in case the night before something happens to the items you're wearing. These are all helpful things to hopefully minimize that anxiety that you have about it. And certainly I think that you have to find your own style. And there are so many different people out there, different ways in which you can present. There is no single way that you have to be as a presenter. And whilst you might attend sort of sessions that say you need to wear a suit or a formal dress to a conference, it's very diverse. And speaking to people within the community is often the best way to do that. But I think that one of the really nice things about academia is there's so much openness, and also it's full of people that have been in the same boat as you, and certainly have been nervous about their first presentations. Think about how you connect those first presentations about your research with the wider world in which you're trying to share your research to. So don't think just about the presentation as your only opportunity to present your work. One of the things you can do, and this is, I think, crucial, especially because you might be attending conferences that are 2 or 3 days long, and yours might be the final present session in the final day, and everyone's really exhausted, is to actually engage with things early on in events. So, and I think this can also help you feel more comfortable too. So one of the things I do when I go to a conference to give a presentation is I try to immerse myself within that community as it's happening, before my presentation and afterwards. Very often now these events are running partly, sometimes it's hybrid events, so you've got an online community tuning in, but also there's often a kind of strong social media footprint to what's happening in the room as well. So there'll be a hashtag that you can follow on social media. And these are all ways of connecting and performing your research by responding to presentations using hashtags and events. For me, they're all part of the the presentation itself, because there are two things I think a presentation needs to do for you. One is to give you a chance to explain your research and hopefully get some useful feedback on it from the peers within your community, but also it's a chance for you to connect and to build those relationships. And I think that looking back, and I guess still to some extent, the purpose of the abstracts presentation, this is something that again is very much dependent on your discipline. In some disciplines there are no poster presentations that people give, but in science it's often a huge part of the program, and you might find yourself with just 2 minutes to speak to somebody about your presentation, about your posters that's sitting behind you whilst they're coming to listen to you talk about it. So you can see how that's a really useful way to align that with something like a social media video, which I'll talk about a bit later. But the amount of time you have to present your poster might be about the same amount of time you have to make a video for social media. So developing those skills, I think there's a really useful synergy, but making that connection with the community is really the core value for me in terms of giving a presentation to your peer group, trying to have an impact on the people in the room, the people that may wish to give you a job at some point. The people may look at you and think, yeah, this person's really got something interesting to say, or they're on an interesting journey. So building relationships is such a key part of what giving a presentation is all about. I think when you look at it from that perspective, you can do a number of things. You can both start to feel that your event itself isn't just the 20-minute presentation that you have or whatever time you've got, it's the entire performance. And you might be somebody that sort of doesn't like networking at events, doesn't like this sort of side of it. But again, think about that you can hopefully build connections by relating to people in that way. So as I started off in my career, these sorts of things weren't terribly common. There weren't many opportunities to share work beyond those conference presentations. As time went on, the power of digital media gave us both opportunities to actually connect more widely, but also to become more creative with the people around us, to reach out in lots of different ways. So giving presentations now, talking about my research, is such a broader thing than it was back then. And I want to sort of pivot now into the second section for today, which is to talk about that wider range of things that you might do. And it's not all about using social media. I want to suggest to you that the types of things you can do to become a communicator, to become someone that researches and then shares what they discover through their work, or indeed discovers and shares whilst they're researching. And I think that's a really key part of it. I often use content creation as a way of working through ideas, and so have found a way to both write, for example, manuscripts for media outlets as a way of working through concepts and thoughts about subjects. It was very common about 10 or 15 years ago to create blogs about research, really very valuable things still to do. And I want to show you some of the platforms that I use to be present within those spaces. But again, they're all kind of multimedia opportunities. And so it's not just about making your own videos to be a content creator in that way. And I think that's something that's really important to bear in mind, is that a lot of the stuff that you see on social media that is people sort of sharing materials isn't how you have to be. And not only that, I think the other thing to remember is that these platforms, I think for us as academics, as scholars, as scientists, whatever it is you're trying to share, to look at them as professional networking tools rather than social media is really important. They are a way for you to build your public profile in a way that hopefully will enrich your career, increase your prospects, but also build those opportunities around that content. So one of the things I encourage people to think about initially is a platform like LinkedIn. And I'm very curious to know what if you're happy to put in the chat what social media platforms you use currently, because of course these things change over time. And so one of the helpful things I think by using platforms to share what you're doing is to be aware of the trends, be aware of what's changing in society. And to appreciate that that's part of the problem which we're wrestling with when trying to share our research. When I started off, it was very much focused on sharing research, not if it's not through academic events, then through getting on television, interviewing for the news, being on radio, writing for print outlets. And these were the ways we did that back then. Now it's something very different. And many of the organizations that you work with will have their own, not just channels of communication, but also massive presences around them too. So, for example, the Wellcome Trust has its own YouTube channel. Most science organizations, many arts organizations too, have their own channels of communication. And you can find a way to work with these channels too. And so thinking about your understanding of how to use the environments is also very much about being able to understand that transformation in society, about how we make content, how we make presentations, how we share what we're doing. And staying on top of that is a helpful way to be aware of the changes within society. You will have seen just how much has transformed over the last 10 years with social media in terms of what people watch on television, if they watch television at all. So understanding these things, I think, is part of being a kind of active citizen as a scientist or a researcher. But the social media platforms that you use presently may simply be social environments for you at the moment. And there's lots of different things that you can do to start to use them in a very different way. So again, if you're not someone that particularly wants to use social media for your own research, you might decide to find a journal that you think you want to be part of, or where your research is particularly relevant, and discover whether they have any social media support. And this is something that is happening all the time, where a journal is just launching, or a journal has got a even established track record, but they have a social media manager. I remember a few years ago, a journal that I was working with advertised for a role as social media manager. And part of, I think, connecting with each other now as researchers is building those communities. And that's an incredibly exciting thing to do, because it's then also forging new connections with each other, thinking about how you make those connections meaningful, especially in a world where increasingly it's harder to be traveling as much as perhaps we did in the past to events which are quite far away. So it's a way in which you can build a very powerful network through those platforms. So I'm going to show you one video now, hopefully, if I can bring it up here on my platform, to show you an example of how I've used this. Excuse me. So let's see if I bring this up and share with you my screen. And hopefully you can see this. By the way, there's also a QR code on here. So what we're trying to do with today is also create a content creators community, and more broadly a kind of communications community as well. So if you'd like to join this community, we've sent it out to everyone on Blackboard, so you can have a look at it and join it through there. But if you have a phone with you and you can open up your camera, you can just tap the QR code. Whoops, there it is, just here, and hopefully it will take you to the WhatsApp group that we're using to share our best practice, to think about content creation, to build more of these opportunities for presenting. One of the things that I do at the university is to chair our engagement forum, and that's another thing to bear in mind. I think you'll have some other training sessions later on in the term where we'll talk about research impact, public engagement, and one of the things we try to do as a university and as a sector is to make sure our research has an impact more widely in the community. So trying to find opportunities to do that is often best done by digital platforms. And I'll give you one example. We have taking place tomorrow night is the launch of Manchester Science Festival, where we are the principal educational partner for the festival. So one of the ways we show support for the event is to actually make content for them across the festival period. And so it reinforces, so content creation in that sense is not about promoting my research or even the research of other people. It's about reinforcing relationships. And I think that's a really key part of why this is a useful thing to do. But the way in which you do that can vary considerably. It's not something that has to be done any particular way. But here's an example, and I'm going to probably talk over it because I'm not sure I'll get the audio. But so this is a video that I made yesterday about a new journal that I'm working with called the Journal of Future Robot Life. And we have a call for papers going out at the moment. The deadline is in December. And what you're seeing is a simple video that tells people about this call for papers. Now, there's a few things sort of happening here. One is about using Instagram as a platform, but the content wasn't created within Instagram. But also you're seeing kind of experimental tools as well within the platform. So you can see these captions coming out of my mouth, which is one of the effects that you can use on Instagram to transcribe what it is you're saying. But I've also got the duplicate transcriptions at the bottom as well. And one of the things to sort of mention about this is that this is all made on a mobile device. And so you have these tools in your hands that are incredibly powerful, but also can be used in lots of different settings as well. And by working with the platform, you can also share it elsewhere too. So this video, which we'll hit play again, has been shared out into other environments too. So it's gone out to LinkedIn, it's gone out to Twitter. The environment itself, the application, Instagram, allows you to make the content. And even if you didn't want to publish it in Instagram, you can save it to your camera roll on your phone and then publish it elsewhere as well. So what used to be really difficult and take lots of time is now a lot easier by using these tools. And that's a key reason to sort of understand their potential. Small things like, why do we have captions on things? It's partly because 80% of the people that watch the videos are not listening to the audio. So you have to think about that audience and whether they engage with it at all, unless you transcribe your content and have those captions there. So the mobile devices that we have, the social media activity that I do is often in support of those relationships that we're trying to develop and maintain and reinforce and extend. So communication in that sense isn't about getting your research out there. It's about building your network. It's about building that collaboration. It's about showing support for other people and hopefully building more opportunities through that activity. And again, you can do that in lots of different ways. It doesn't have to be you presenting it. It doesn't have to be for you to sort of share what you're doing. I want to show you a few other examples here. So we got another example from an event that we produced about 3 years ago now. So I'm going to play that for you now, and hopefully it'll give you a bit of a sense of how we've done this in a different way with some physicist and an artist.
Come with us, John.
Mike was muted then. That video is from the Blue Dot Festival in the Northwest, which brings scientists, people from actually all disciplines, to talk about their research to a basically a music festival going audience. For me, it's a really important example of what you can do as a communicator. So what we have in that video, what you're seeing is an artist from the University of Salford working with a physicist from the University of Manchester, creating a live VJ set during the festival that people can come along to. Now, the content within that set comes out of the research from the physicist, and the artist is sort of realizing it, visualizing it as people are watching. So for me, it's a sort of example that shows you just the breadth of things that you can do as a communicator. It's not just about you sharing with your voice what it is you're doing and the findings you've got. It's also about developing collaborations around really experimental formats of communicating research. I think that year we were the only event to bring science into the music program. Blue Dot Festival is a great example of how you can bring science into a music event, a music festival, in a really creative way. The University of Salford often takes work to the festival that happens in July every year. So again, if you want to get involved with some of these things, there's opportunities to connect. There's also opportunities for you to propose ideas as well. And I'd be very happy to hear from any ideas you've got about what you'd like to curate or create or organize. And so your starting point may not be presentations or making videos. It might be, well, let's see if we can create something interesting, something different. And some of that can be kind of really sort of simple. Some of it can be really complicated. Here's another example of something we did in July this year that was quite a simple production, really, but part of the work of the Science and Industry Museum in Manchester, where we put together a kind of demonstration of the research we do that takes place out in the Amazon in Brazil. Took place last night at the Science and Industry Museum in Manchester, where a number of our researchers from the wildlife team were talking to the public about the research they do out in the Amazon in Brazil. We have a long history of connecting with that part of the world, rich of biodiversity, and all of these things come together in research that tells us about the state of the planet. You can find out more about this research by following Salford Wildlife on Instagram. So that video, as you can see, was essentially part of a bigger event that was taking place over that night. And communication is also about understanding who else is around you that's trying to do the same sort of thing. Museums are often organizations that are very keen to bring real-time sort of research into their environment. And this is across different disciplines. Some of the festivals that we work with are more focused on arts. We have festivals on business. A big festival that we've exhibited at over the last couple of years has been the Digital City Festival that happens at Manchester Central. So thinking as a communicator is also thinking about this network of events, organizations, and researchers that are trying to kind of mobilize and organize beyond just the academic research. The Digital City Festival is a great example of what is really an industry-facing festival, but we had researchers from many disciplines give presentations during it, people working on artificial intelligence, people working on digital marketing. And so you can find opportunities outside of your academic network to present your work in a very different way. Salford University is particularly good and particularly experienced at making sure we connect academic and industry activity. And so thinking about your own profile, it's reaching out beyond that academic roles as well, and trying to connect with people who are doing similar things, really. And I think that's one of the other things you learn by taking your research beyond the academic walls, is that there are lots of other researchers who work in industry. Often they're doing even better research. And so it's quite a humbling thing often to think about reaching out beyond your academic discipline, because you see just different ways of working, different ways of innovating, and also different types of projects you can get involved with too. So making yourself kind of visible publicly as somebody that's able to do that, someone that's able to go beyond academia, is a really useful thing to do. It also gives you, I think, a broader sense of what the academic career involves as well. That's another big learning point for me in terms of thinking about my own presentation interests, apart from anything, and to move beyond just thinking that you have the opportunity to present an academic conference and that's about it. There's so much else that's out there for you to contribute towards, and often those things can lead into collaborations. And so it's partly thinking about yourself as a brand, which is a mindset that I think is useful to get into, because it then also gets you to think about your career as a trajectory that you're monitoring, evaluating, assessing continually, and trying to make sense of. I do this a lot, so I'm very sort of thoughtful about these things and try to be aware of my own digital presence and try to keep some handle on managing that. So, and also to sort of showcase what I do as well to people, because that's another thing that's hard to get across. Especially, I've seen a great example is the academic CV, and I've worked with professors. It's probably about 10 years ago. I remember a professor that was very, very experienced, very far into his career, and his CV was 30 pages long. And in this world of incredibly fast moving content, how do you present yourself in a way that gets across your capabilities, but also does it in an efficient, quick way? One of the reasons why I make video content for the university and for other academic associations is I know that that's often the only thing people will watch. And often the most busy people are the ones that don't have time to read a long piece of text, even a long email. So if you can get something across in 2 minutes, then that can be a really helpful way to do it. So thinking about yourself as a brand and managing that identity is, I think, a useful way to also reflect on where you're going. And here's an example of a reel that I created a few years ago now, but it gives you a bit of a sense of how you might present yourself and think about yourself in that way, not least because you'll work with lots of different organizations over your career. You're kind of freelancer. Ultimately, you'll move from one university to the next, maybe work in industry from time to time, but you won't work in some of these places unless you actually have that presence. So here's a reel that gives a bit of a demonstration. I need to update it, but it's still reasonably okay. It's showing you how I present myself to the world. So it's quite a quick video, probably about 40-50 seconds, something like that. It gets across some of the things that I do. I will do things like host events. That's another thing to bear in mind, that the better you get at giving presentations, the more you'll get asked to do other things like chair sessions at conferences, or to host events yourself, or to be able to produce events like this using professional streaming software. These are all things you can do to level up your presentation skills. And again, the more you do it, the easier it gets as well. We've also created lots of different types of events. I want to show you some examples of that. And I guess ultimately want to get you to think about the different ways in which you might actually convey yourself as a communicator. Here is a list of the different things that you can do within communication to share what you're working on, to connect with others, to build that profile, and to really hit home the idea that there is no one way to do this. You don't have to be somebody that's making videos like David Attenborough or Brian Cox or whoever is the sort of presenter that you see. There's a lot you can learn from those people. And I think there's so much actually on social media platforms that can inspire you to think about different ways in which you can communicate, that there is multiple styles out there. There's multiple ways in which you can perform as a researcher, and you don't have to be someone that's high energy, high velocity, and fitting into a mold that doesn't suit you. But also, one of the things that I've done over the last year or two is to host a podcast for the university using the platform called Anchor, which is a really fantastic platform that allows you to build your own podcast with relative ease, really. And I think that's another thing that's really valuable is that so much of what I'm talking about is now far easier than it was 10 years ago even. So the podcast that I create, which I'll share with you in the chat here as well, which is a podcast that gives me a chance to interview researchers across the university about their work. And one of the reasons to do that is that many of our researchers just don't have any kind of public presence. So if you Google somebody's name, you won't find anything. And a step towards getting more content or something about them and the research out there is to host an event, a podcast episode. And this platform, Anchor, is a fantastic free platform that allows you to create your podcast. You simply record the audio, upload it, add some different elements to allow you to then build your components to your podcast, your introductory sound, connecting audio pieces, and then publish it as an episode that can go out across all the different channels that people use to access their podcast. So if you go into your Spotify account, and search the University of Salford, you'll find a podcast that we produce, and it's all free. It's all really accessible to do, and much of it can be done on a mobile device as well. So you can be a podcaster. If you don't want to be on screen or be on video, you can make audio. Audio is a huge thing that's massively successful for many platforms. If you go onto Twitter, for example, they're very much pushing an audio component of Twitter. I tweeted something yesterday that uses that facility. So you can just share audio if you don't want to make video. There's also platforms like Clubhouse that are elevating audio content as well. But you can also do things like write. There's a great platform that I use. That's the place that I publish my sort of thoughts about just things that interest me. So not academic publications as such, but actually just thoughts about things that interest me. It's a kind of blogging platform, but it's also, I would say, a kind of wider community of authors, many of whom are making money through the platform. So using the platform is a useful way to understand how writing for publication is changing too. And that's another massive thing to get I guess, really your head around is that the academic publishing world is expanding. We have increasing numbers of open access journals, increasing numbers of publishers that are creating their own spaces. A great one is the Times Higher Education. So if you want to build your presence within the community, writing for the Times Higher, they have a new platform called the Campus, which is out there for people to write for and make content for, which is a really useful way to build, again, your presence within the community. Writing for your professional journals is one way in which you can build that public presence around your research. You can also become a facilitator of workshops. A few years ago, we produced a workshop which got people to think about the future of robotics. And we asked families to come along together to make robots out of Lego that then engaged them with the idea about what robots might be used for in the future. And we needed people that could facilitate that workshop. So it might be that your preferred outlet as a communicator is to create workshops, to be someone that hopefully is able to encourage people to share what they're doing, engage with what you're doing, or to run demonstrations as well. You can have people invited to demonstrations of things. We have a lot of work in schools outreach that's also really important. We have schools that reach out to us as a university and ask for us to come and deliver workshops, and that might be where you want to go. You can be an event manager, you can be a live performer. There's comedians out there that come from an academic background that are sharing their research. There's musicians that are we've got a friend of the university who's a fantastic musician who's sharing research through their musical output. We've got a number of our researchers use music as their principal subject to originate ideas and to hopefully experiment with their work too. We've also got curators. We have many researchers who have worked on things like kind of social projects that then have created imagery that's exhibited within galleries. And so you might think of yourself as a photographer, as a documentarian, ultimately someone that wants to document the world and share those outputs more widely. Photography is a fantastic way to share what you do as a researcher. And that's certainly something that hopefully will avoid you from being too sort of focused on yourself, to actually create your own presence around other forms of creativity too. We've also created large-scale installations as part of collaborations, and here's one from Manchester Science Festival from a few years ago now, which was again a good example of how being a good communicator involves being able to be a good collaborator. So this installation, which is from Manchester Science Festival, as you can see, involved lots of people doing lots of different things. And we've got artists there. We've got people that have designed the props, we've got creative technicians, we've got scientists that are helping to realize the kind of scientific message and narrative through the piece. And all of these things are crucial to making this event happen, which was, as you can see, trying to create an air-based aquarium that people could walk through, and you've got fish floating in the sky, and something that's incredibly successful, especially with children, to get a sense of being immersed in a very different place. And it was a really lovely way to also build relationships. The relationships have had a legacy now for 5 years. So the artist you're seeing in there, a guy called Paul Miller, is someone that we're working on with a festival called Light Waves, happening in December at Salford Quays. So these opportunities to create, to experiment, to innovate really with different formats of communication are also fantastic ways for you to build novel relationships, and particularly build relationships outside of your discipline too. On the premise that actually the best way for you to innovate as a researcher is to keep agile, to keep connecting and exploring and discovering. I remember another professor when I was a PhD student telling me that he was probably sort of late 40s, quite, relatively far into his career, and he felt that he'd sort of run out of things to say, or run out of things he wanted to research and investigate. And I think you have to be mindful of that as a researcher, because it's very hard, I think, to maintain the motivation and self-belief that what you're doing matters. It's hard to do that over a PhD, and there are so many things that I think are helpful for a PhD researcher by sharing their work through communication tools that keep you motivated. And it might be, simply that these are helpful ways for you to break up your day, to think about how you have things going on beyond just the writing or the research, but actually a part of a bigger network, a bigger community, to not feel as isolated as perhaps you might otherwise. So communication is also a way for you to feel part of the community too, especially, I think this is one of the big challenges with doing research, is to not feel too isolated. It is so much that is very much reliant on you driving everything forward, but doing so in a collaborative way is a real challenge, I think, especially if your area is very sort of isolated from other disciplines. So communication is great, I think, for you as a researcher in terms of your own progression and your own development throughout your PhD. It's also great for you connecting with that wider community, even understanding that wider community as well. Understanding the wider community around your research, discovering the academic associations and what they're doing, being part of those communities. And there are lots of different platforms that allow you to do that really well. I think there's still a role for the academic email list. So if you're not part of an academic email list, find the one that's in your subject, start one up if there isn't one. And many of them have their own PGR fora too. So you might be able to create your own network as well. Many of them may not have social channels that allow them to connect their researchers through these environments. And that can be a really effective thing as well for you to get involved with. And all of this is part of that communication world. The idea that communicating research is just about making a video or giving an academic presentation is really one of the myths, I think, that this presentation has really been about. To avoid thinking about it as being just one way of being a communicator. There are lots of things that you can do to make a contribution, to build your confidence, and hopefully ensure that you remain aware of the best ways to do that as you go through your career. It's very common to hear more senior academics feel very distant from these new ways of which we can communicate and reach out and share and connect. And there are people that just don't understand them. And I think for me, it's also really important to be involved with them in order to stay abreast of some of these trends. And it's, I think, harder as you get older to do that, but keeping aware of them, keeping a bit of an insight into what you can do is a really great way to do that. So one of the things I'm going to finish off about 10 minutes, but I want to give a couple of demos as we finish off. And then, as I mentioned at the start, we'll finish with an Instagram live. I'll just step through how you can do that. But I want to show you a couple more examples of things we've done. This is an event from March this year. And this gives you a sense of, again, the scale of an installation you can create that allows you then to bring different people into this communication world. People who perhaps don't see themselves as being a part of it, or perhaps aren't comfortable with doing things on their own. But this is a nice example of how you can So as you can see, this was a installation where we showed people virtual reality tools and gave them a bit of a sense of what it's like to experience virtual reality. We had people from all different disciplines that were there talking about their research, using the technology as a way of engaging people about the research they were doing. So these were many of the students involved with the delivery weren't necessarily people that wanted to make videos, to give presentations, but in this installation, they would have quite nice one-to-one conversations with the audiences as they came along and tried out the technology. They could talk about the research in a quite an intimate setting, but be part of something that was even bigger. And that's, I think, a useful way to do it. And we had multiple elements to this as well. So here's a sort of screen video of the virtual reality world that we created alongside the event. So this is a sort of walkthrough the immersive space. The figures that you can see there are people that are logged into the platform. So you can see me walking around here. This environment was created as a kind of curated space as well. So we were presenting content from across the university, examples of things that we were able to show people, but also give them access to beyond the physical installation in the room. So people could log into this through their mobile phones or through their computers and experience the content. So to make this possible, we needed people that could actually design the spaces, think about the types of content we showed people, but also then think about the in-person experience within the virtual world too. And that was not a minor challenge. So you might see yourself as someone that's a curator of a digital world that people can enter. And this is, I think, part of the excitement around what's happening right now with things like the metaverse and the possibility that people can experience new spaces, imagined spaces, and environments that otherwise just wouldn't be possible to create or imagine. So your role as a communicator is incredibly diverse, and you don't have to fit into any particular mold. Giving a presentation isn't just standing up in front of an audience and saying something, although there's lots we've covered today that talk about ways in which you can do that more effectively. Preparing yourself in advance, rehearsing what you're doing, getting to know the space before you get into the room, thinking about your open line, making sure that you run through the slides and the timing of things, making sure that there's no unhappy surprises for your presentation, like you've set up a timing and you have to wait for an animation to come up. These sorts of things are all helpful ways to ready yourself. Making sure that when you get up there, you talk to individuals in the room, not a big audience. And often things like making eye contact with specific people, saying something to somebody in the room is a useful way for you to feel more relaxed as well. But it's so much more than that. It's about that journey into your academic world, that community of people that is around you also creating content too. And I think that's another thing to sort of appreciate, is that if you do a scan of your peer group, of your community, you'll see that so many people are doing so many different things to share what they do and to make their research more accessible to a wider audience. And that's the mission. The mission is to make what we do meaningful, useful, valuable to the community. The entire history of many of the disciplines that you're working in, especially if you're in a STEM discipline, come out of the 1980s and realizing that a huge amount of what we do just doesn't reach the public. So we saw then a maturation of investments into STEM-related communication, birth of science festivals. The first one was Edinburgh in 1989, and we now have a huge number of these events across the world that take place, bringing science, technology, arts, you name it. Every discipline is welcome in many of these events to wider audiences. And what for me is really exciting is that they also show you parts of the world that otherwise you wouldn't access as a researcher. You wouldn't discover unless you stepped outside of that academic group. And that's a really a big eye-opener. Often at events, we go to, for example, Cheltenham Science Festival every year and take work there. And that's a big festival that's very integrated with the publishing world too. So you'll often find presenters, speakers that are talking about their latest book. And this is a useful way to understand really the industry around ideas creation and research and all those things that perhaps you don't encounter until you're later on in your academic career. But if you think about them early enough, you can sort of build the platform for yourself to make your own work more relevant earlier on in your career rather than wait until you're sort of halfway through it. Things like working with academic agents, people that will help you get publishing deals, these sorts of things are part of that ecosystem of the science communication world. And it's a really useful way to see what there is beyond your discipline and beyond your research. For my own PhD, I hoped by the end of it, I would have a book that would come out of my PhD. And at the end of it, I realized that nobody would want to read my PhD apart from peers. So I went through a whole process of rewriting the PhD essentially for a book format, and understanding how you can do these things in parallel is a really useful thing to do early on again in your career, so that you're not just sort of waiting until that point and you have to sort of start again. So we have another few minutes left. I'm going to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but I want to show you a couple more things on the mobile device to give you a bit of a sense of how I've used them in my own research, and how I'm hopefully trying to connect with people using these environments, which are still sort of challenging, I think, to use, and yet it's always something that requires relearning something as well. And that's another part of this process, is to hopefully stay quite agile as a researcher and as a learner. For me, it's all about making sure that I can keep learning as a researcher rather than just think I've done it and then keep it going, which just never works. So here we have a little demo of the mobile device I have at the moment. So I'm going to finish off with a small demo, and then we'll go live on Instagram and you can see a bit about how that works. So I think I wanted to end this partly because I want you to finish up today and have a kind of key awareness of what you can do right now after the session to start to build and think about this. And one of the things you can do is to download these platforms and start to use them. Things like making films is so much easier. Here's an application called CapCut, for example, which, as you can see, once it opens up, it's a free platform. You can then create your video by adding the content into it. Let's add a video here. Actually, let's go for this one. This is a nicer one to have. We'll put that one in there. We can add the video into the timeline. You've got then here your timeline tools, so you can do lots of different things, like you can edit, you can strip your timeline if you want to, just split it into two sections, delete a bit. You can then add an overlay to it if you wanted to. You can add a photographic overlay, for instance. So let's put that on top of it. If you want to have some graphical overlays, you can add it onto it. All of these tools in the past used to be far more expensive and inaccessible, but they're now free. They're incredibly versatile. You can do things like transcribe text as well. So you can add text, create auto captions, and all of these things are so easy for people to use. Let's try splitting this clip. You can add then a transition to it. So if I click on here, you've got basic transitions. Let's do a camera transition so we can add a swirl to the content. And by experimenting with these, you can see the different ways in which you might want to create content. You might want to use different effects within it. This is all material and technology that you can simply download to your mobile devices. So making the videos is easier than it once was. I'd really encourage you, if you're sort of anxious about the amount of time you spend on mobile devices, to think about content creation as a healthier habit than content consumption. So, but also to think about your own professional identity within the environment too, so that you're not then making the platform or your own content about you as a person, making more about you as a researcher. It can be a useful way to think about how you start to build that footprint of your content as well. So you can add lots of different things into this and then export it as a video file that you can then upload to whichever channels you want to put it into. I want to show you also then Instagram, which again is a great example of how you can make your own content. And we'll try to do a demo. I've not tried this before. We'll see if it works. I'm going to make a reel here. So Instagram, if you haven't seen it before, don't use it. Works on the basis of different types of content. You've got the image post or video post that you see in the feed. If I go back to my screen, you'll see content from the feed in this particular channel. And you can make posts within the channel. You can make video reels, and we'll go ahead and make a video reel. So as you can see, we'll click on reel here. We'll get started. It tells you what you can do to make a reel. So we'll try to make a video reel, and let's see how this works. So this is a video reel for the Salford University Postgraduate Researchers, and we're demonstrating the use of Instagram, and hopefully we'll get it working quite effectively. So we'll hit now stop. We'll go to next. We'll then add the captions and see if that can work. So again, just to demonstrate how these things work in a way that's quite seamless. So the content that I just recorded now has the captions added to it. You can manually edit some of these things to give you then make sure you correct any errors that are within the auto transcription that's happening. But as you can see, it's a really quick way to do things like transcription. You can then change the size of that. You can change the colors of it. We can add a background to it. Let's change the background of that. You can then add these effects that I showed you earlier, the special effects with the mumble captions. Actually, let's try some bubble captions, see if that works. So we've got these bubble captions now coming out on the video. All this technology was something that just was possible to do without advanced editing skills. And now we can do it super easy. Of course, a big part of the economy of social media is the sounds as well. So you can add music to your video, which will hopefully increase its visibility. You can add links, you can add polls into it. So if you want to add a quiz, you can do that too. But all of these are helpful ways to make your content more engaging. And once you get to that point, you can then post it as a reel. So it doesn't have to be you presenting about something. It's worth thinking about how you communicate what it is you want to share. It has to be engaging to get lots of views and followers, but ultimately, for me, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is your own personal development within the platform and how that helps you progress as a researcher. That's the bottom line from everything I've said today. How can these tools, how can these opportunities to present give you the chance to progress as a researcher, to ensure that you stay up to date with the latest technology, ensure that you can help others use them, and hopefully make that part of your working life, so that you're not just doing one thing either through your PhD or afterwards. There's so much you can contribute by using tools like this to work with academic associations, work with the universities that you have as well. And it's a incredibly powerful skill to have, particularly because universities are so focused on their digital reputation, and so much of what we do reaches people through digital platforms now. That's the key thing for a university, is to make sure they can do this effectively. And there's so much at stake for them in terms of reputation. So you can bring these things into your own workflow and make them effective for you for your career progression, but also to enrich your life, I think, as well. That's another key thing. And it's not always going to be easy, either getting up on a stage or making a video or doing that well and feeling you're happy with it, but it's developmental. When I look back on nearly everything that I've done in the past for my research, it's always felt embarrassing to do so, because the work itself either doesn't resonate with how I see myself, or I feel like I could have done better. So I think you have to just take that on the chin and accept that that's going to be something that happens with your content creation, with your presentations, that every time you do it is something you get better at, hopefully. And so we're going to wrap it up now. I'm going to switch over to Instagram Live in a moment, and we'll do the demonstration and see how it works. Maybe we can, if Jelka's still in the room, we can say hi and bring you into the chat as well. But otherwise, thank you all for the opportunity to talk to you about this. I hope that at the end of this, you have a sense of the breadth of how you might communicate what you're doing, and discover your pathway into being a communicator of research knowledge. See the potential it has to grow your network, grow your collaborators, bring new opportunities to you, but also bring new ways in which you can relate to others, either in your community or outside of it. And that interface between what we do in academia and research and what we do outside of that world is such a critical part of universities today. It's, I think, one of the key missions of a university to find its place within the community, and that's not a minor thing at all to work out and be part of, because there are also incredibly exciting people that are trying to reimagine those spaces. So with that in mind, I'm going to now say goodbye to people here. We're going to go live on Instagram. As you can see, the Engaged Salford. I'll keep this channel open during the live, but I'm going to prioritize talking to the live channel as well, so we can see how those two relate to each other. You can also rewatch this on YouTube after the event, and so you can have a look at it and look back, think back about the content I've shared. And that's another big part of why I wanted to do it this way. We've done it on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, in order for people to see that once you do it that way and do more of it, you can feel more comfortable, which is ultimately what this is all about, building your own sense of what the what the potential is to reach out to people. So yeah, let's see how this works. So Jelka, I can see you in the room. Let's just take the stream off for a second, and we'll get things started in a moment. That was a bit of a whirlwind, Jelka.
Yes. Exactly.
It's hopefully been a useful thing for people to hear about, and hopefully we've covered quite a lot of ground in it that's giving people food for thought.
Yes, I can see some good comments here. I'm very pleased that it's been received as an interesting session, an interesting opening session for our PGR training program. Not many students attending here with me, but nevertheless, we have others online. That's exactly how this was supposed to run.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for setting it up. And these
one
are all
great
things
thing,
that
if I can just say one thing, I think this is a great start, and it will link really well with the research impact session we're having on the 8th of November. So I invite all the students to not miss that one.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for setting it up, Jelka. I'm going to say goodbye to you. I'll bring in this stream now so we can see how it works, if it works, but we'll give it a go. If anyone is on Instagram, you can join it live, but I'll keep this channel open so you can just see it as it's happening, just to give you a bit of sense of how it works. But thank you so much, Jelka. Okay, let's get this going. So we're going to switch to here. Here's the link to the channel that I mentioned. You can use to connect with others that are also interested in using social media for sharing content more, and hopefully also people that might want to just connect with each other more widely on communication opportunities. I'll share with you things that are going on around the university. We'll share best practice. We'll look at some great content. So if you want to join that WhatsApp group and have a look at the QR code here and join the community. You can also find me on all social media platforms under Andy Meir. So you can find me on WhatsApp or wherever it might be by just Googling. So let's give this a go. So we're going to go here. So as you can see here, we've got the options to either reel, post, story, or live. We're going to go live. We're going to give it a title, and we're going to go live with Salford PGRs as a title. Okay. Whoops, there we go. PGRs. So we've got a title to our live, and let's see if we can see. Yep, we're going public, and this is how lots of people are creating content now for social media. A lot of the live content is incredibly successful. Let's go for it. You can also do a test as well to see if it works. Thanks, Alex, for the comments. So we're now live on Instagram under the Engage Salford account, which is streaming also into our YouTube channel. So let's give you a bit of a demo. You can see the sort of interface and what it looks like. You can see people joining there at the bottom. You can wave to people. And what we've done in the past is to have sessions where we've invited people to join our lives, have a conversation about their research. We've done a number of Meet the Researcher conversations as well. So I know that we're very keen to get you all sort of making this sort of content more widely. So if you'd like to sort of set up conversations, one of the things that's really cool is to actually just not worry too much about being in these spaces. People can have conversations. People are used to having conversations on digital media. So those that are joining on Instagram at the moment, we can see some people joining already. This part of a Salford University Postgraduate Researcher session that's currently streaming live on YouTube. We've got a dual stream taking place here. We have some audience in YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and also now we've got people in Instagram too. And we've been talking a lot about the number of ways in which you can communicate your research across social media platforms, creating events, by working with others outside of your discipline to experiment with communication tools, but also to grow your network as well more widely. So these tools are fantastic ways for you to feel less isolated, I think, is a key part of the message for today, that the academic journey, the research journey, at times that's ultimately what we want as well. We want to be isolated enough to research our subjects, but we also want to find times to connect with others too. So social media tools can be a way for you to build community, can build relationships with others, and hopefully enrich your day-to-day life as well. I found that often by talking about my research in social media, on live events, is a useful way for you to reinforce your knowledge also. I remember a professor that I worked with, she said that if you haven't said it on television that you don't really know what you believe. And somehow there's a way in which you kind of come to terms with the merit of what you're talking about, what you're saying as a researcher, by doing it publicly outside of your kind of safe spaces of academia. The public channels kind of give you a frame of reference that's very different. And so if you can share what you're doing on social media in public and get more comfortable with doing that, the better you will be as a researcher, I think, as well. And that's another really valuable reason to do this. Being a researcher is about being publicly present. It is about thinking about the opportunities to innovate by sharing what you do as well. There's a great quote from Mark Walpott, who was the former chief science officer for the British government, who said that good science ends with communication, which interestingly, I think gets you to think about the need to communicate what we're doing to bring the public along with us. But I think that good science begins with communication. Good research begins with communication, because it's in those conversations that we have with each other about ideas, either in the coffee bar or at the conference or online, wherever it might be, or in a presentation, a pitch for funding. All these are moments where you can explain what you're thinking, get across something either well or poorly. And there are opportunities that follow from doing one or the other. If you don't manage to get it across in a conference presentation, you may not be someone that people think is able to express themselves and someone they'd like to employ for teaching. If you can't get it across on a social media video, you may not be able to reach some of those networks and communities around you. So finding ways to do that is, I think, a key part of being a fully loaded academic, someone that is able to actually step into different worlds and different spaces. And as you go through your career, you'll realize that so many of these things become far more important the more senior you get, that actually being able to talk to people outside your discipline and communicate what the essence of it is massively important for lots of different sectors, lots of different aspects of what universities try to do, whether it's collaborating with industry, building new facilities, explaining to potential funders why what you're doing is important. These are all really crucial ways to get across what it is you're researching. So the skills that we've talked about today in the session, and if you are joining on Instagram for the first time, you can access this video on YouTube on the School of Science, Engineering and Environment channel. You'll find it all there. But it's trying to find ways in which you can build those skills, not just one way. It's no longer just a case where, as an academic, you do your PhD, you get up on a stage, give a presentation to your peers. It's so much more wide than that, I would say. It's so broader, but also so much richer. So we're going to wrap things up. Thank you all for those that have joined the online stream, either on Instagram here or on YouTube here. It's been a fun experiment for me to try something else new. And we're going to sign off now. And thank you all for being here. Follow up with the WhatsApp group if you'd like to. We'd love to sort of hear from you, and I'll send some content into that channel as well. And hopefully we'll get some people around some of the events that are coming up. But thank you all, and goodbye.